All right, let's move to Libya. The UN Security Council is expected to decide today on a resolution that could greenlight a no-fly zone over Libya, but also authorize more aggressive measures. It's what one person told me, a by any means necessary clause, which could allow airstrikes to keep Gaddafi's forces from taking the rebel capital, Benghazi. Libyan state television has ominously warned civilians to leave the city for it to be, quote, cleared. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice, had this to say last night.
The U.S. view is that we need to be prepared to contemplate steps that include but perhaps go beyond a no-fly zone at this point as the situation on the ground has evolved.
Joining me now is General Wesley Clark. He's a former Supreme Allied Commander for NATO, and he's a senior fellow at UCLA's Burkle Center for International Relations. He, of course, commanded NATO forces during the air campaign in Kosovo and in 1999, and he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post earlier last week saying military intervention in Libya would be a mistake. General Clark, thanks very much. I want to start with what's going on in the United Nations right now, what's being debated, because it's now beyond a no-fly zone. The United States wants something. It doesn't get spelled out in the way it's done, and you can explain this further, I hope, but it would basically give, perhaps it's NATO, perhaps it's the Arab League, perhaps you bring in Egyptians and Saudis to actually do it, but the ability for international forces to bomb a no-drive zone, if you will, Gaddafi's forces to prevent it from getting to Benghazi.
Well, I think that those are all the logical measures that need to be looked at and approved internationally before the United States does anything. And, Chuck, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that the United States should never do anything in Libya. I was asked to look at the lessons of past interventions, and the lessons are that you have to have a basis for intervention in international law. You need an international group to go in there, and when you start it, you need to be prepared to go all the way through the process to get the desired outcome. If the desired outcome is the removal of Gaddafi, it may well take airstrikes and more. So that seems to be the direction we're going. I would only ask why we don't start with a call for an immediate ceasefire in place, followed by a diplomatic mission to try to transition it to a representative, legitimate government, and keep all of the authorities in reserve. First, use diplomacy when all diplomatic means have been exhausted, then go transition to other measures. But first things first.
Well, let me show you, I want to play for you a clip from Secretary Hillary Clinton's interview with Andrea Mitchell about this idea of whether, frankly, it may be too late to do anything in Libya. Here's what she had to say.
What if it's too late? Well, Andrea, we're very aware of the actions of the Gaddafi regime. We deeply regret his callous disregard of human life, his absolute willingness to slaughter his own people. But we think that there is a lot that can be done if we can reach international agreement on what should be done.
And General Clark, Senator John Kerry, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, he said in a speech yesterday, I don't like that we've lost this time. It's compacted the choices, diminished the options, and it's changed the state of play somewhat. It seems to push back a little bit on your argument. You say you got to exhaust all these other resources. One could argue that the last couple of weeks, there have been a lot of measures that have been exhausted, and now you're at the point where Gaddafi's on the doorstep of Benghazi, potentially about to slaughter thousands and thousands of Libyans.
Well, Senator Kerry's right to be impatient about this, but we know from past experience that you've got to be able to line up the so-called diplomatic ducks in order. The first thing to have done is to call for a ceasefire in place of all forces. And
no, I'm going to stop you there. When you say call for a ceasefire, Gaddafi doesn't seem to be a guy that abides by suggestions like that. But you mean a specific UN, something that is, the UN calling for a ceasefire, some sort of official call or ask?
Absolutely, because that mobilizes international opinion and facilitates getting the stronger authorities that are necessary. Okay. And Senator Kerry and Secretary Clinton are both right. There are a lot of other measures, and we've got to make sure we've got things lined up the right way so that if this drags on not a week, but a month, 6 months, that when you look back at it, you say we did everything possible we could do to save people on the ground and to use our own resources and our troops wisely before we rushed into something that just put us in an act of war, because there are nations apparently who don't agree with our perspective on Gaddafi. He's worked a long time to charm nations in southern Africa. Some of these apparently are expressing support for Gaddafi. We've got to bring the greatest possible pressure to get it stopped as soon as possible. The quickest thing to call for is a ceasefire in place. If he disobeys and rejects that call, then it facilitates moving to the more to the stronger measures.
Now, it's my understanding the Russians at the United Nations tried to put up a ceasefire resolution, and it's basically been summarily rejected. So you believe that's a mistake?
Well, it depends on what the wording is in the ceasefire resolution. I think you have to tie all of these diplomatic measures together. If you were to put a ceasefire resolution up and say, call for ceasefire, wait 3 weeks and see what happens, well, that's a mistake. We're going to reject that. But starting with the call for a ceasefire and moving through the no-fly zone and the authorization under Chapter 7 to do more, that's the logical flow that this should unfold with.
Okay, but I guess we are where we are today. He is on the doorstep of Benghazi. Now what do you do?
Well, I think, you know, this is a time that the nations of the Arab League and NATO are going to have to come together. I'd prefer to see Arab League leadership in this.
Do they have the Air Force? Does the Arab League have the air power to do this? I mean, is it Egyptian and Saudi Air Force essentially?
Well, they have the air power to participate in it. And they may not have all the Air Force command and control elements required, but they could certainly send a couple of squadrons of fighters. They could take the front line of it, and they should do that.
And is that your expectation at this point? The Arab League, by endorsing the idea of a no-fly zone, is now prepared to go that next step? I
think that there's a discussion underway to try to do this. This always is a little tricky because you've got to do the diplomatic level discussions and the military discussions simultaneously and work the feedback between the two levels. But yes, those discussions, I'm sure, are underway now, and hopefully we'll get not only participation by the Arab League, but out front leadership by the Arab League. All right, General Wesley Clark, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander and a veteran of these both diplomatic and military campaigns. Thank you for joining us this morning on the Daily Rundown. Thank you. All right.